How does somebody spot a narcissist?
So it's easier said than done, right? It's so easier to sort of get the long lens and view him as a lab specimen, a person who has this personality of, but there's signs we look for, right? And they take a minute to show up. That's why I tell people, don't be mad at yourself if you're in a relationship for a year before it dawns on you, like, might be this person seems really narcissistic, and it took me a long time to see it. So a person who's narcissistic has variable, inconsistent, and shallow empathy, and sometimes very little empathy. They're entitled, they're grandiose, they're arrogant, they're selfish, they are dysregulated. They can't manage things like their anger. They're constantly validation and admiration seeking. They take advantage of other people. They envy other people. They can be quite manipulative. They're motivated by power, dominance, and control. That's really what a narcissistic person is. So how do you spot that? It's one thing to give you a laundry list. It's quite another to say, how does this show up? There's different ways that it shows up. One way is that it is that the narcissistic person will be even in the early what we call the love bombing phase where it's on. Like they're often at their best. They're trying to win you over. It feels like they hung the moon. You'll still see that they get impatient. They can be quite contemptuous or dismissive of a person who works like at a bar or the restaurant you go on a date. They might get really, really agitated if the reservation's not ready on time or they're being made to sit in a line or there's some kind of mistake. They get really reactive. If you make even a small critique or even a piece of feedback, they'll just lose it. And you'll say, "Oh, okay, that's not the charmer I was talking to even an hour ago." They'll often interrupt you while you're talking or not really listen to you. There'll be a sense that even if they're looking at you, it feels like almost like they're looking through you rather than looking at you. They're not sort of like attuned, is the word that we would use. There are other interesting soft signs. If you live in a city, I live in LA, where people drive. Narcissistic people drive very dangerously. There's actually research that shows an association there. They'll drive really fast, faster than the conditions would warrant. They'll drive up on someone's bumper. They'll honk. They'll cut people off. They'll give people the finger. So it has like a road ragey vibe. Pay attention to that. That's not just someone's like who has a fast car and they're just like boys in their toys. It ain't that. It's a pretty it's a surefire sense that this is a person who might be narcissistic. It's all of these things, these little signs. You're looking to see, do they compare you to other people a lot? Maybe they compare you to an ex or even someone they work with. They may be dismissive of something you do. So you'll be telling them something you're excited about, like, "Hey babe, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I don't get it. Like doesn't sound like that would be that hard, but sure." So they get their dig in. So there's these signs that get sprinkled early on, but no one's going to walk up. It's never going to be but the most toxic stuff, the stuff that really shows us that someone's narcissistic, isn't going to show up early on. It takes a minute. Like I said, that's why a lot of people need 6 to 12 months to figure out that this is the situation in their relationship.
Wow, 6 to 12 months. That's a lot longer than I would have thought. And I think one of the adversities, I should say, in the subject of narcissism, we were talking about this a little bit before we recorded, is that the word has become used so much that I think it's become desensitized a little bit in that everybody is now a quote unquote narcissist. If somebody's not interested in them, they're a narcissist. If somebody doesn't answer their phone, they're a narcissist. If somebody fill in the blank, they're a narcissist. You put out a lot of content online on the subject. I'm sure you're observing stuff and just shaking your head at times. What are some of the biggest misconceptions you see out there regarding the subject of narcissism?
Yeah, Doug, I'm so glad you brought that up because it's actually disconcerting to me because people who actually are in narcissistic relationships are now who are already prone to self-doubt are now doubting themselves more saying, I don't know, like that's my relationship is this and it's not that. It's a lot worse than this. Maybe I'm calling it the wrong thing. Or people are just sort of also being judgmental. So when somebody's genuinely in a narcissistic relationship, it's saying, oh, everyone's saying everyone's narcissistic. So some of the misconceptions are that that laundry list I gave you of all the things that make up a narcissist, that any one of those things would make someone narcissistic, right? Just being entitled doesn't mean someone's narcissistic. Just being validation seeking doesn't mean someone's narcissistic. So any one of these things, and even like you had said, just thought a person who's narcissistic is sort of full of themselves. Just being full of yourself does not make someone narcissistic. Cheating does not make someone narcissistic. That's a popular one I see online. This fool cheated on me. He's a narcissist. I'm like, this fool cheated on you. I get that. We're going to need to a little bit of a deeper dive for me to figure out if this person's narcissistic. The other thing is that we assume that it's always going to be men. No, there's a lot of narcissistic women out there. There's enough people out there who have narcissistic mothers that I can tell you now there's obviously narcissistic women out there. So we make this misconception it's always a guy. Now, it's more often a guy. I will say it's definitely much more prevalent in men, but it's definitely not the only game in town. And when we talk about the more vulnerable, victimized, resentful, sullen, anxious, self-monitoring kind of form of narcissism, like, everyone's out to get me, that we see that is equal in men and women. So it's not just men. It is not, again, it's not always just the I'm full of myself. Like I said, there's different subtypes of narcissism, and it doesn't always look like the person who's sort of got that kind of salesperson vibe, who's walking in and is sort of holding court. That's a very common and almost a very sort of baseline form of narcissism, but there's many forms of it, including malignant narcissism, which can actually almost feel like psychopathy light. There is communal narcissism, which is very much the people who are out there on Instagram. Aren't I the best? I saved 1,000 ducks this weekend, but they're actually really an awful narcissistic person, but they get validation by do all their do-gooding. So there's all these subtypes too. So it's not just the braggy kind of arrogant kind of person. So these misconceptions kind of lead people to bandy about this term, to use it as an insult, which is really dangerous because it's a good word. It captures some really important territory in terms of relationship behaviors and patterns. But I mean, the internet's the internet. You don't need to be smart to drive it. So anybody can get in there and say whatever the heck they want.
Why do you think there's more male narcissists than female narcissists?
I think part of it, a lot of it probably has to do with socialization. So if a girl, child, little girl, shows up with some of the qualities that a boy, narcissistic child was showing up with, she'd be more likely to be shut down. I think that peer relationships are different for girls, but I think a big difference is boys are shamed for emotion, especially negative emotion, crying, anxiety, fear. That we still, I still was recently somewhere, like it was recently a few days ago, and someone's little boy, it's a little kid, like he's probably 4, 5, 6 years old, and he got hurt. And the dad's like, come on, dust off. That's enough of that. And I was like, oh man, you've got to be kidding me. Like, let the poor kid cry it out. So we shame emotion in boys. We shame emotion in men. And as a result, there's a real constriction around that emotional expression that can really build up that sense of shame and insecurity in men, because there's really no way to express vulnerability. And if in through that vulnerability comes strength for men, but that's not how we're socializing them, and we humiliate men who show emotion. So as long as that's the game, and we actually do also socialize men to be more assertive, to be more aggressive, to be strong, to play sports in a certain way, stand up, be a man. And be a man is sort of the meta meaning there is sort of be gruff, be up in someone's face, none of this, all this silly feeling stuff. So all of that combines that I think that the socialization narrative for men, cis men, hetero men, is very, very different than it is for girls. That said, since there's more than enough narcissistic women out there, that there's still that socialization is not going to stop that track for girls. But I think for a girl, that's almost like if a boy and a girl were teetering, the girl may actually, because she might have different kinds of emotionally held peer relationships, her father, who might have yelled at the son for crying, might actually hold her and hug her. So she might learn a different kind of an emotional regulation and vocabulary.
Do you think there's any correlation between being self-absorbed and being a narcissist? Like somebody who posts a bunch of selfies, for instance, like, do you think that they're more likely to be a narcissist?
The research is interesting. There's many research studies that have been done that look at the association between the posting of selfies and narcissism. And not surprisingly, there's a strong association, right? And so, but here's where we have to be careful. Just because the two are correlated doesn't mean they're the same thing, and doesn't even mean that one causes the other, right? What it means is that one might be a little bit of a marker for another. Show me a narcissist, and I'll show you a bunch of selfies or a lot of self referential, self absorbed internet content, but not always. And you can also show me someone who posts selfies, and I'll say, I don't know, this is a person who loves posting cupcakes or adores their dog or cat. You can look at the nature of the content and all of that, but at some level, we have to be very careful. Just because a person posts a selfie, it doesn't make them narcissistic, even if they post a lot of selfies and they're annoying selfies. But if when they show up as a person, they're well regulated, they're kind, they're empathic, they're self aware, they're not narcissistic. They just like posting selfies.